being advertised, and the first thing I'd like to talk about is the tunnel, because there's a persistent story going around for years that there is a tunnel from the school here to the church. There isn't. I've probably got to get that straight away, but one can see how the problem arose, because room 1, that's the nearest room to the church. Rooms 1 and 2 are now the school offices, by the way. Room 1, where many of us sang along with Nifanwi for years, there was a trapdoor in the floor, and it was not fixed down. And so, lifting it up, one could see a space underneath, and that was enough to give rise to the story of the tunnel, because fantasy is always more expected than fact. It's more attractive as well. But the interesting thing to me is that there is an unusually large gap between the floor and the soil, all underneath the mansion. Access can be gained from the cellars. I don't know, you've been in the cellars. I'm afraid the door is locked, but the cellar door is just behind the small staircase in the mansion. That gives access to quite extensive cellars. And from those cellars you can get into this gap between the floor and the soil, and you can crawl all the way under the mansion. In fact, some people have. And I certainly have, when I was young. And other people have, because initials and dates are chalked underneath the floor. And of course it was largely the school printing group that were beyond control. And they sort of pursued everything that was going. And one chap actually told me that he lay underneath the head study and listened to Dr. Wolf's conversation. But why, one wonders, was there such a large space between the floor and the soil? Well, my theory is, and I've never spoken to an architect about this, is that they were most concerned about rising damp. No damp courses when that house was built in 1858. So the architect decided to provide that big gap and also to build a terrace round the outside of the house. And if you crawl into the gap in space, you'll find that there are pipes, ventilation pipes, leading out to the front brick of the frontage of the terrace. So he seems to have been concerned about making sure that fresh air could get underneath the house and the damp didn't rise. And that's the curious reason, I think, why the house is built in that way. So, no tunnel. Obviously, when you think about it, who would want to dig a tunnel from Bishopshalt to the church? To the Red Lion cellar, perhaps? But the house was built in 1858, and there's nothing really sensational happened since then to warrant anybody building a tunnel. And of course, it's an enormous task to build a tunnel anyway, so nevertheless, the story will persist, I'm sure. Next thing, I don't know whether you were aware that there are various stories about a ghost haunting the premises as well. The first person that talked to me about it was the long-serving secretary, Sybil Chinnery, who had been fire watching here in the Second World War. It was felt desirable that there should be somebody on the premises every night in case of a bomb falling and incendiary incidents and so forth. And every night there was one member of staff and 2 sixth formers on a sort of rota. And Sybil Chinnery, being a member of staff, was in the medical room where there was a bed. I don't know what the youngsters did, I'm sure. But the medical room in those days was at the top of the mansion stairs. You go up the mansion stairs and there's a door right ahead, and that was the medical room. So Sybil was in there with her dog one night, door was shut, and footsteps came by. And she was sure there was no one else around. The dog, pricked up his ears and was very reluctant to go out afterwards, but they did tentatively open the door, and of course there was no one there. That's story number one. Secondly, in 1968, 2 lady cleaners resigned. They'd been working in the mansion part of the school after dark, in the winter, and they were convinced that there was something strange going on, noises and so forth. And so they resigned and said, we can't work here anymore, and they went. In 1986, a girl pupil felt unwell, and she went into the girls' cloakroom and sat down and leant against a radiator. And then she became aware, she told us later, of a vague figure that appeared, a young girl in a pinafore dress, wearing a school tie with arms outstretched. She ran through the figure to get out, went back to the classroom, and her friends said she did appear to be genuinely shaken and very pale. In 1983, once again, the story of a girl pupil who claims to have seen a figure of a young woman dressed as a maid coming down the mansion stairs. She was a small figure with shoulder-length blonde hair, black dress, pinafore, and a maid's cap. Well, those are the incidents that I know about that have taken place. Whether they are fact or fiction is another matter, because fantasy is always more attractive than fact. And as far as the pupils are concerned, you often wonder whether they are seeking notoriety. And in any old building, the temperature changes and there are all sorts of creaking noises. Quite amazing, actually. So I suspect there is a straightforward explanation for that. Thirdly, the moose. Well, what we know is that it was in the house before the premises became a school. It was there when Mr. and Mrs. Thomas were living there in the early part of the 20th century. There is a footpath running across Coney Green to the main road, and at the far end on the left is a property called Green Cottage. And there was a family there for many years called Gorham who were in the building trade. When William Thomas, the last owner, died in 1920, Mrs. Thomas stayed on for a bit, then decided that she and her unmarried daughter couldn't possibly cope with these enormous premises, and so they decided to sell up. And they gave the moose to the Gorham family. Now, fortunately, I met some of them at a funeral, as one does. And they told me they had used it as a hat and coat rack. And they had it until the early 1950s when they decided that they didn't want it anymore. Can you imagine that in an ordinary house? That's an enormous thing, really, when you get it down. So I can quite understand why they wanted to get rid of it. So it was returned to the school in the early 1950s, put up where it is today, and it's been there ever since. When it first arrived, I don't think we know. The house was built in 1858 by a London builder called John Jackson, and his firm specialised in interior decoration and plasterwork. He spent so much money on building that house, laying out the gardens and grounds, building the outbuildings, stables and so forth that were here, he got into debt for £6,000, and he couldn't pay. So, having built this wonderful place for himself, he had to sell out after 3 years only. Now, in 1861, there is an inventory of the premises, and it does say that in the billiard room, there are 3 cue racks and 30 cues, 1 billiard table, 3 marking boards, and 5 stags' heads. That's not a stag, so it probably doesn't go back that far, but sometime, I suspect in the Victorian era, the moose arrived at Bishopshalt. 2 footnotes to that. some of you may remember the occasion when the prefects, for a lark, decided to take the moose down and hide it. The joke went badly wrong because nobody noticed it had gone. So it was raked out of the cellar and put back where it still is today. And about 40 years ago, an old pupil who now lives in Canada came back with her husband to visit, and they told me that that is in fact a young moose whose head is on the wall there. And they also brought me a jar of preserved moose meat as a gift. Well, I showed it around, but I couldn't face it. That went. And finally, the moat. Now, this is not fantasy. We have here, actually, definite information that the earlier house back in medieval times was surrounded by a moat or ditch. Please don't think of an enormous castle moat, not much more than a big ditch, I suspect. In the Civil War, after King Charles died, or was executed, the Commonwealth took over, and at one point they confiscated all church lands. And that means this site, because of course at that time it belonged to the Bishop of Worcester. So the bishop's tenant, who was living here, was just turfed out, and a Commonwealth sympathiser was brought in, a man called Thomas Carter, who actually came from Tain. So he came to live on these premises for a while. But the great thing about this from our point of view is that the Commonwealth sent down a couple of commissaries to write an account of the premises, describe the premises, and really find out what they were worth. I think that's what they were really interested in. So, two men came down and surveyed the property, and fortunately that survey exists. I'll read you part of it. This manor or rectory consists of meadow, pasture and arable lands, also a fair manor house lately built with brick. And we do know that the house before this one was built about 1610. To which belong 2 fair barns with stables and other outhouses. The house has a great hall, kitchen, parlour and chambers, which house is for the most part compassed with an old moat, within which is also an orchard and garden, the same garden being enclosed with a fair brick wall. So there we are. There's the first evidence that we had of a medieval moat or ditch surrounding a premises. But is there any sign of it today? Well, I would suggest to you that the boundary of the ornamental garden is in fact the route where the moat was. The front part has gone, but you can still see where the boundary was at the back. I've left a diagram out in room 3 to show the position of where I think the moat was. And that was supported actually by, I think it was 1986, when there was a very, very dry summer. And suddenly, on the front garden, or wilderness as we used to call it, and nobody does nowadays, an L-shaped dip appeared in the ground. And it lined up precisely with the boundary of the ornamental garden. So I think that was the front corner of the moat had reappeared after a few hundred years. So there's the evidence that there was in fact a moat surrounding the garden, probably put in by the Bishop of Worcester, maybe in the 13th or 14th century. I have trouble with gardeners that want to fill that L-shaped gap in, but I think it just about survives today. Well, there we are, ladies and gentlemen. There we are, the tunnel, the ghost, the moose, and the moat. Can I just finish with a little story which has nothing to do with those 4 things. I recently attended the funeral of an old pupil called Don Thompson. He died aged 88. Fascinating character, he spent his whole life in scientific research. And in his 20s, he was working at the AID at Harefield. And in the laboratory, he received an unsigned Valentine card. He wanted to find out who it was. So he fingerprinted the card. He got the fingerprints off the card. He managed to get, subtly the fingerprints of all the girls at the office, and he found out who'd sent it. And they went out together, and they eventually married, and they were happily married for over 50 years.